The wind howled through the monastery ruins like a banshee's lament, whipping Elena's dark hair across her face as she knelt beside the trapped creature. Rain had begun to fall in earnest now, each droplet striking the ancient stones with the persistence of a funeral dirge. The wolf's massive frame shuddered with each labored breath, its silver-touched fur matted with blood and something else, something that gleamed like starlight even in the storm's darkness. Elena's hands trembled as she reached toward the iron trap, a sensation she hadn't experienced in decades. Vampires didn't tremble. They didn't feel uncertainty or the crushing weight of possibility. Yet here she was, her supernatural composure cracking like ice under spring sun, because those eyes, those impossibly blue eyes, held memories that belonged to a man who had died in her arms 140 years ago. "Easy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. The wolf's gaze never left hers, and she saw something flicker there, intelligence far beyond animal instinct, recognition that went soul deep, and a pain that had nothing to do with the iron teeth buried in its leg. The trap was old, forged in an era when blacksmiths still knew the old ways, when iron was blessed by priests and carved with symbols designed to hold creatures of supernatural origin. Elena could smell the blessing on the metal, acrid and burning, like incense mixed with grave dirt. Her vampire nature recoiled from it, but she forced herself closer. She had touched blessed iron before, during those early nights when she'd first begun her penance among these mountains, learning to override her immortal instincts in service of something greater. Thunder cracked overhead, illuminating the scene in stark relief, the wolf's enormous form dwarfing even the largest natural predators she'd encountered, the monastery's broken arches reaching toward the storm-torn sky like skeletal fingers, and her own pale hands poised above a trap that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. She had been walking her usual route when the sound reached her, not the howl of an ordinary wolf, but something closer to a human sob, raw with despair and centuries of accumulated grief. It had drawn her like a moth to flame, past the safety markers she'd established around the old monastery, past the warnings carved into trees by locals who still remembered why certain places should be left undisturbed. This monastery had been abandoned since the plague years, its bells silent, its prayers unanswered. Elena had avoided it for good reason. Places where faith had died violently tended to attract things that fed on despair, and she had worked too hard to build her quiet life to risk exposure to the supernatural politics that still raged in these ancient mountains. But tonight, something had called her here. The wolf's breathing grew more labored, and Elena realized she was running out of time to decide. Touch the blessed iron and reveal her nature to whatever intelligence watched from those blue eyes, or let a creature suffer when she had the power to help. It wasn't really a choice at all. 40 years of penance had taught her that redemption lay in action, not hesitation. Elena placed her hands on the trap's mechanism, and blessed iron burned through her supernatural flesh like acid. She bit back a cry of pain, feeling her skin blister and blacken where it made contact. The wolf's eyes widened, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of her burned flesh and something else. Recognition flashed across its features, so human and immediate that Elena's undead heart stuttered. The trap's springs were corroded with age but built to last centuries. Elena applied pressure slowly, fighting through the iron's burning touch, using strength that no human veterinarian could possess. Metal groaned and protested, but gradually the jaws began to separate. The wolf remained perfectly still throughout the process, those luminous eyes never leaving her face, as if memorizing every detail. When the trap finally released, the wolf's leg was a mangled ruin of fur and flesh, silver blood pooling on the monastery stones. Elena reached instinctively for her veterinary supplies, then stopped. The injury was too severe for conventional treatment, and they were miles from her clinic. But she had other options, dangerous ones that would require her to reveal more of her true nature. The wolf struggled to rise on 3 legs, favoring the injured limb, but instead of fleeing, it moved closer to Elena. Its massive head came level with hers as she knelt beside the discarded trap, and she found herself staring into eyes that held the weight of centuries. When the wolf's cold nose brushed against her burned hands, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since her transformation. A spark of connection that seemed to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, between predator and prey. The touch sent images flooding through her mind, a man's face, candlelight, the taste of mortality, and the agony of loss. The storm began to intensify, and Elena knew they needed shelter. But as she looked into those impossible blue eyes, she realized the real tempest was just beginning. The wolf collapsed before they reached the tree line, its massive frame hitting the muddy ground with a sound that cut through Elena like a blade. She knelt beside it immediately, her veterinarian instincts overriding everything else as she assessed the damage. The blessed iron had done more than tear flesh. It had poisoned the wound, preventing the accelerated healing she'd glimpsed in those first moments after freeing the creature. "We need to get you somewhere warm," she murmured, surprised by the tenderness in her own voice. She hadn't spoken to anyone with such care since before. The wolf's eyes fluttered open at her words, and again she felt that impossible recognition, that sense of standing on the edge of a precipice she'd thought sealed forever. Her clinic sat 3 miles down the mountain, a converted shepherd's cottage that had served as her sanctuary for the past 15 years. It was modest, practical, designed to draw no attention from the scattered villages below. Most importantly, it was warded, not against supernatural creatures, but against human curiosity. The locals knew Dr. Vasiliev as an eccentric recluse who treated their animals with unusual success and asked no questions about payment. They left injured creatures at her door like offerings and collected them days later, healed and healthy. It was a carefully constructed life, built on layers of mundane routine that masked her true nature. Morning rounds through the forest, cataloguing the wildlife populations that existed in delicate balance around human settlements. Afternoons in her laboratory, preparing medicines and studying the intersection between modern veterinary science and the older knowledge she'd accumulated across a century of immortal existence. Evenings spent reading by lamplight, working through her guilt one saved life at a time. She had built something worth protecting here, something that gave her immortal existence meaning beyond the hunger and violence that had defined her first decades as a vampire. The thought of losing it, of being exposed, hunted, forced to flee again, sent ice through her veins. But the wolf was dying. Elena gathered the creature in her arms, marveling at how something so massive could feel so fragile. Its fur was softer than anything natural, with an underlying warmth that spoke of magic rather than simple biology. As she carried it through the storm, she found herself remembering other nights when she'd rushed through darkness with precious cargo, before she'd learned to wall off her heart behind professional distance. The clinic's familiar scents, antiseptic, herbs, the lingering warmth of animals successfully treated, usually brought her comfort. Tonight they felt like accusations. Every careful routine, every small ritual of her constructed mortality seemed suddenly fragile as spun glass. She laid the wolf on her examination table, the same surface where she'd treated hundreds of ordinary creatures over the years. Foxes with broken bones, deer wounded by hunters, the occasional escaped livestock. Simple cases with predictable outcomes, problems that could be solved with skill and patience rather than the supernatural abilities she kept carefully hidden. This was different. The wolf's breathing had grown shallow, its heartbeat irregular in a way that spoke of more than physical trauma. Elena's enhanced senses picked up something else. A familiar scent woven through the creature's natural musk, like cedar smoke and winter nights, and the particular warmth of human skin she'd once known as well as her own. Impossible. She had watched him die, had held his cooling body while her own humanity bled out through the wound that would transform her forever. Mikhail was gone, had been gone for more than a century, leaving her with nothing but guilt and the endless years of penance that had become her existence. Yet her hands trembled as she reached for her supplies, the same tremor that had seized her at the monastery. In 127 years of immortal existence, Elena had learned to control every aspect of her supernatural nature except this, the way certain memories could still reduce her to the frightened girl who'd once believed love could conquer death. She had built a life around saving others because she couldn't save the one who mattered most. Every healed animal was an apology to the man who died in her arms. Every night of solitude a reminder that some failures echoed across centuries. It was a clean kind of suffering, purposeful and contained. The wolf's eyes opened, fixing on her face with that same impossible recognition. Elena's careful composure cracked completely, 40 years of constructed normalcy threatening to crumble beneath the weight of a single glance. She thought of her quiet routines, her small rituals of redemption, the peaceful existence she'd carved from decades of discipline and self-denial. She thought of how easily it could all disappear. Lightning illuminated the clinic's windows as Elena reached for instruments that might save a life, or might damn her to lose everything she'd spent decades building. In the wolf's eyes, she saw the reflection of choices that would define not just this night, but all the lonely eternities that stretched beyond it. The storm outside intensified, but the real tempest was just beginning. The instruments felt foreign in Elena's hands, each tool carrying the weight of an impossible decision. She had performed thousands of procedures in this clinic, her movements precise and clinical, her vampire nature carefully masked beneath layers of professional competence. But now, as she prepared to treat a wound that defied everything she understood about the natural world, her century of carefully maintained control began to fracture. The wolf's silver blood had stopped flowing, congealing around the edges of the wound in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Elena had seen blessed iron wounds before. They festered rather than healed, burned with spiritual fire that rejected supernatural flesh. But this was different. The metal had left marks that looked like runes, ancient symbols she recognized from texts she'd studied in her mortal life, when she'd believed in things like destiny and sacred purpose. Her scalpel hovered over the damaged tissue, and she realized conventional surgery wouldn't be enough. The iron's blessing had sunk deep, creating a spiritual infection that would require more than medical knowledge to heal. It would require magic, the kind she'd sworn never to use again. A century ago, when grief had driven her to desperate measures and darker arts, Elena had learned that vampire blood could heal almost any wound. But the cost was always transformation or addiction, creating bonds that enslaved the healed to their savior. She had used this power exactly once, trying to save a dying child in a plague-ravaged village, and watched in horror as her gift twisted into curse. The child had lived, but as something between human and monster, forever thirsting for what Elena had given him. That night had taught her the difference between salvation and damnation, a lesson that had shaped every choice since. Now, staring at the wolf's labored breathing, she felt that old temptation stirring. One drop of her blood, willingly given, could heal any wound the blessed iron had caused. But if this creature was truly what those impossible blue eyes suggested, if the scent of cedar smoke and winter nights wasn't her imagination playing cruel tricks, then healing him would create a blood bond that could never be broken. The clinic's walls seemed to close around her, as the weight of possibility settled into her bones. Everything she'd built here, every carefully constructed day of her redemptive exile, balanced on the edge of this moment. She could tend the wound conventionally, probably save the wolf's life through purely mortal means, and preserve the safe distance that had protected her for decades. Or she could risk everything on the impossible hope that love could somehow survive death itself. Thunder cracked overhead, and the lights flickered. In that moment of darkness, Elena saw the wolf's eyes begin to dim, its breathing growing ever more shallow. Time was running out. She reached for her surgical kit, then stopped. Her enhanced hearing had caught something new, the distant sound of engines struggling up the mountain road, 3 vehicles moving with purpose despite the storm's fury. They would reach her clinic within minutes, and Elena knew with cold certainty that no one traveled these roads in weather like this unless they were hunting. Vampire hunters. The old families that had pursued her kind across centuries, drawn by the scent of supernatural activity like bloodhounds. She had been careful, so careful, but the monastery ruins were a known nexus of magical energy. Her intervention there, combined with the wolf's otherworldly nature, had created ripples in the spiritual fabric that certain sensitive humans could track. The wolf's eyes fixed on hers again, and this time she saw something that stopped her heart completely. Recognition, yes, but also understanding. It knew what was coming. More than that, it was trying to communicate something urgent, desperate, as if time itself was about to run out for more reasons than just blood loss. Elena found herself at the crossroads she'd spent 40 years avoiding. Save the wolf using her supernatural abilities and face whatever consequences emerged from the approaching vehicles, or let it die and preserve the carefully constructed mortal life that had become her prison and sanctuary both. In the distance, the engines grew louder. Her hands moved toward the surgical instruments, then toward her own wrist, then back again, trembling with indecision that felt like cowardice. The wolf watched her internal struggle with those impossibly blue eyes, and Elena realized that whatever choice she made would echo across not just her own immortal existence, but across the vast web of history and consequence that connected all supernatural creatures in these ancient mountains. The storm intensified, rattling the clinic's windows. Lightning illuminated the wolf's silver fur, the pools of otherworldly blood, the instruments that could save or damn them both. In that stark moment, Elena understood that her 40 years of peaceful exile were ending whether she acted or not. The only question was whether she would face whatever came next alone, or with the impossible hope that some bonds could survive even death. The engines were getting closer. Elena's hands froze above the wolf's wounded form, as the engine sounds grew from distant rumble to inevitable approach. Her carefully constructed world, every morning routine, every patient successfully treated in anonymity, every night spent reading by lamplight instead of hunting, crystallized in her mind like something already lost. 40 years. 40 years of building trust with the mountain villagers who left injured animals at her door. 40 years of perfecting the role of Dr. Vasiliev, the eccentric veterinarian whose unusual success rate prompted gratitude rather than suspicion. 40 years of small, meaningful redemptions that had slowly convinced her that monsters could choose to become something else. All of it would crumble the moment she revealed what she truly was. Her enhanced hearing tracked the vehicles with painful precision. 3 sets of engines, diesel-heavy and determined, navigating the treacherous switchbacks despite the storm. Vampire hunters never traveled alone, and they never gave up once they'd caught a scent. She knew their methods: flash burn the clinic, scatter blessed salt across the ashes, move on to the next rumor. They wouldn't care about the innocent animals in her recovery cages, wouldn't pause to consider that she'd spent decades healing rather than hunting. The wolf's breathing hitched, drawing her attention back to eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated sorrow. In their blue depths, she saw a reflection of her own impossible situation, trapped between survival and sacrifice, between the safety of isolation and the terrible vulnerability of caring. What if I'm wrong? The thought pierced through her paralysis like blessed silver. What if the familiar scent was memory playing tricks on a lonely mind? What if those eyes held nothing more than animal intelligence, and she was projecting a century of guilt onto a creature that simply needed medical attention? She had spent so long atoning for Mikhail's death that perhaps she was seeing his ghost in every impossible situation. But if she was right, if this creature somehow carried the soul she'd mourned for 100 years, then letting it die would be losing him twice. The first time she'd been helpless, a newly turned vampire with no understanding of her own nature. This time she would be choosing his death to preserve her comfortable exile. Her hands moved toward the surgical instruments again, then stopped. Conventional medicine wouldn't save a creature wounded by blessed iron, not with that spiritual infection spreading through otherworldly blood. She could try, could spend precious minutes on procedures that might ease the wolf's passing without exposing her nature, but she would still watch those blue eyes dim forever while hunters pounded at her door. The engines were closer now, perhaps 2 minutes away. Elena could picture the hunters, descendants of ancient bloodlines who'd made careers of stalking her kind, armed with weapons forged in monastery fires and blessed by priests who understood the old wars. They would have detected the magical disturbance at the monastery ruins, followed the supernatural signature like a beacon through the storm. Her wrist throbbed where her own pulse should be, a phantom sensation that reminded her of the power flowing through undead veins. One small cut, one drop of freely given blood, and she could heal any wound the blessed iron had caused. But vampire blood always came with a price: addiction, transformation, or bonds that transcended death itself. What if that's exactly what this is? The thought struck her like lightning, illuminating a familiar landscape. What if the blood bond was the point? What if some part of Mikhail's soul had been waiting a century for her to choose love over safety, connection over the careful distance that had protected her broken heart? The wolf's eyes began to flutter closed, its massive frame shuddering with each labored breath. Elena realized she was crying, actual tears, something she hadn't done since those first terrible nights after her transformation. The salt burned against her pale cheeks like tiny brands of accusation. Outside, the storm intensified as if responding to her emotional turmoil. Rain lashed the clinic's windows, and wind howled through the mountain passes with voices that sounded almost human. In the distance, she could hear the hunter's engines pause. They'd reached the final turn before her property. Minutes, perhaps less. Elena's gaze swept across her sanctuary one final time, the shelves lined with carefully organized supplies, the recovery cages that had housed hundreds of grateful animals, the laboratory where she'd perfected the intersection of modern medicine and century-old knowledge. It was a good life, built on meaningful work and genuine purpose. It was also a life built on hiding, on never fully engaging with the world she'd sworn to serve. The wolf's breathing stopped. For one eternal moment, Elena felt the weight of absolute choice pressing down upon her immortal shoulders. Save the creature and face whatever consequences emerged from the approaching lights, or let it die and preserve everything she'd built from decades of careful penance. In that moment of perfect silence, she finally understood that redemption had never been about the life she'd constructed in exile. It had always been about what she was willing to sacrifice for love. The headlights swept across her windows as the hunters arrived. Elena moved with the decisive grace of a predator finally unleashed from decades of careful restraint. The moment the wolf's breathing stopped, something fundamental shifted inside her, not just choice, but transformation. She pressed her wrist to her lips and bit down, feeling her fangs pierce flesh for the first time in 40 years. The taste of her own blood was copper and starlight, power and promise. "Forgive me," she whispered, though whether to the dying wolf or to the life she was about to abandon, she couldn't say. The first drop of vampire blood hit the wolf's tongue as Hunter's boots pounded up her front steps. Elena felt the ancient magic surge through her veins, the terrible intimacy of blood calling to blood. The wolf's chest hitched once, twice, then resumed breathing with renewed strength. Its eyes snapped open, not the dimming gaze of a dying animal, but something blazingly aware. The front door exploded inward, as 3 figures in dark tactical gear burst through, armed with weapons that gleamed with religious blessing. Elena didn't turn to face them. Instead, she kept her bleeding wrist pressed to the wolf's muzzle, completing the bond that would either damn them both or offer salvation beyond anything she'd dared imagine. "Dr. Ena Vasiliev," the lead hunter called, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "By the covenant of sacred blood, you are bound to answer for supernatural crimes against the natural order." Elena finally looked up, her careful human mask falling away completely. When she smiled, her fangs caught the lamplight like points of silver fire. "I answer to no covenant but my own choosing." The wolf stirred beneath her hands, silver fur rippling with energy that had nothing to do with animal biology. The blood bond was taking hold, creating connections that transcended flesh and time. Through the mystical link, Elena felt consciousness rising, not animal awareness, but human intelligence wrapped in supernatural form. Male, ancient, heartbreakingly familiar. Mikhail. His name resonated through the bond like a prayer finally answered. 140 years of separation, of believing him lost forever, dissolved in an instant of perfect recognition. The wolf's blue eyes held not just intelligence now, but memory. Love. The devastating joy of impossible reunion. "Step away from the creature," the hunter commanded, raising a crossbow loaded with what Elena recognized as blessed oak. "Whatever it's shown you is illusion. Shapeshifters are masters of deception." But Elena was no longer listening to threats from mortals who understood nothing of the forces they presumed to judge. Through the blood bond, she felt Mikhail's consciousness expanding, remembering. The curse that had trapped him in wolf form for over a century was weakening, her freely given blood acting like a key in an ancient lock. She helped him sit upright on the examination table, no longer caring that her supernatural strength was fully visible. The careful pretense of humanity she'd maintained for 40 years lay in ruins around her feet, as shattered as her clinic door. There was something profoundly liberating about the destruction, like shedding skin that had grown too tight, too confining for what she was becoming. "You don't understand," Elena said, still not turning toward the hunters. Her voice carried new authority, the confidence of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. "This isn't about crimes or covenants. This is about choosing love over fear." The wolf, Mikhail, began to shimmer, silver fur dissolving into motes of starlight. The transformation was beautiful and terrible, magic older than human civilization rewriting reality around them. Through the bond, Elena felt his curse breaking apart like ice in spring sunlight, her vampire blood providing the supernatural catalyst he'd needed to reclaim his true form. The hunters shouted warnings, commands, threats. Their weapons discharged, blessed bolts shattering Elena's equipment and setting fires that would consume everything she'd built. But Elena felt only profound peace as she watched the man she'd loved and lost and mourned begin to materialize from dissolving magic. She was crossing a threshold that would change everything, leaving behind the safe harbor of her constructed mortality for waters unknown and dangerous. The hunters would pursue them. Other supernatural creatures would be drawn to the power they'd just unleashed. The blood bond would create complications and vulnerabilities she couldn't yet imagine. None of it mattered. For the first time in 140 years, Elena Vasilyev was no longer running from love. She was running toward it, hand in hand with the impossible made manifest, leaving the ashes of her careful existence burning behind them. As Mikhail's transformation completed and he reached for her with hands she'd thought never to see again, Elena understood that redemption had never been about earning forgiveness for the past. It had always been about having the courage to embrace an uncertain future. The clinic burned around them as they vanished into the storm together, crossing the threshold from which there could be no return. The storm embraced them like a living thing as Elena and Mikhail fled into the night, his hand warm and impossibly real in hers. Behind them, the clinic blazed against the darkness, 40 years of careful construction reduced to ash and memory. The hunters' shouts faded beneath thunder and wind, but Elena knew pursuit would come. It always did. "The blood bond," Mikhail gasped, his voice exactly as she remembered. Deep cedar smoke and winter nights. "Elena, what have you done?" She pulled him deeper into the forest, her vampire senses navigating paths invisible to mortal eyes. "What I should have done a century ago. Chosen you over safety." But even as the words left her lips, she felt the truth of his concern resonating through their mystical connection. The blood bond thrummed between them like a second heartbeat, beautiful and terrifying in its intensity. Every emotion, every sensation flowed freely from one to the other. When Mikhail stumbled over a root, Elena felt phantom pain shoot through her own ankle. When her fear spiked at the sound of distant engines, his protective rage answered like an echo. "This will make us visible to every supernatural creature in the Carpathians," Mikhail said, even as he squeezed her hand tighter. "Blood bonds create ripples. The old families will sense it. The treaty councils will demand explanations." Elena had known this moment would come, when her sheltered existence would collide with the larger supernatural world she'd avoided for decades. In her exile, she'd nearly forgotten the complex web of alliances, territories, and ancient laws that governed creatures like herself. Vampires weren't solitary predators in these mountains. They were part of an intricate ecosystem of power that had existed since before human memory. There, Mikhail pointed toward a cluster of standing stones barely visible through the trees. The threshold circle. If we reach it before dawn, we'll have sanctuary long enough to understand what we're facing. The stones loomed out of the storm like fingers thrust up from the earth itself, carved with symbols that predated Christianity by millennia. Elena recognized them from stories whispered in vampire courts, neutral ground where supernatural creatures could meet without fear of immediate violence. She'd never needed such places during her exile, but now she felt their necessity like gravity. As they stepped within the stone circle, the storm's fury seemed to diminish, though rain still fell in silver sheets. The space between the monoliths hummed with protective energy, ancient magic that recognized their supernatural nature and granted temporary haven. "We're not alone," Elena whispered, her enhanced hearing catching the soft pad of approaching feet. 3 figures emerged from the forest. A woman with the ethereal beauty of the Fae, her silver hair braided with thorns, an elderly man whose eyes held the golden gleam of shapeshifter heritage, and a vampire Elena recognized from centuries-old memories, Counselor Dmitri, whose authority extended across half of Eastern Europe. "Elena Vassiliev," Dmitri said, his voice carrying the weight of official judgment. 40 years of exemplary isolation, and now this. His gaze moved to Mikhail with calculating interest. "The cursed wolf of Brasov. We had wondered what became of you after the monastery fell." The Fey woman stepped forward, her movements like wind through leaves. "The blood bond registers across 3 realms, vampire. Such magic demands explanation before it destabilizes existing treaties." Elena felt Mikhail tense beside her, his newly returned human form still adjusting to civilized interaction. Through their connection, she sensed fragments of memory, decades of enforced transformation, the slow erosion of human thought beneath animal instinct, the constant ache of incomplete existence. "I claim the right of precedence," Elena said, drawing upon laws she'd learned in her first decades of vampire existence. The bond was formed in defense of life, not in pursuit of power. The shapeshifter elder laughed, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Defense? Child, you've just created one of the most powerful mystical connections these mountains have seen in 3 centuries. Every supernatural creature within 100 miles will seek either alliance or destruction." As if summoned by his words, new presences emerged from the storm. Elena counted at least 6 additional figures, more vampires, what appeared to be a coven of witches, and something that moved with the fluid grace of water elementals. Word of the blood bond was spreading faster than she'd imagined possible. "The question," Counselor Dmitri said, his tone suggesting this was a formal hearing rather than chance encounter, "is whether you understand the responsibilities such power entails. Blood bonds create obligations that extend far beyond personal desire." Through their connection, Elena felt Mikhail's growing unease. He had knowledge she lacked, understanding of supernatural politics gained during his cursed decades of observing rather than participating. The weight of laws, treaties, and ancient grudges pressed against her consciousness like gathering storm clouds. For 40 years, she'd existed in blissful isolation from this world. Now, standing in the circle of stones with impossible love finally restored to her arms, Elena realized her greatest test wasn't surviving the blood bond itself. It was learning to navigate the supernatural society that would either embrace or destroy them both. The weight of supernatural scrutiny pressed against Elena like a physical force as more figures materialized from the storm-lashed darkness. Through the blood bond, she felt Mikhail's memories stirring, fragments of the political landscape he'd observed during his century of enforced silence. Vampire houses with territorial claims stretching back to the Ottoman Empire. Shapeshifter clans whose treaties had been negotiated in blood during the Napoleonic Wars. Ancient beings whose very existence depended on maintaining the delicate balance of power she'd just shattered. "The Vassiliev bloodline carries old debts," Councillor Dmitri continued, his golden eyes never leaving Elena's face. Your sire, may he rest in well-deserved ash, left considerable obligations unfulfilled when the hunters finally claimed him. Elena's breath caught. She'd spent decades believing herself free of her maker's legacy, that geographical isolation had severed those connections. Constantine died in Prague in 1889. His debts died with him. Did they? The Fey woman's voice carried the music of winter wind. Tell me, vampire child, what do you know of the Covenant of Shadows? The name struck Elena like a physical blow, memories surfacing that she'd buried beneath decades of purposeful ignorance. The Covenant, a supernatural treaty signed in blood and starlight, binding the major houses to mutual protection and shared obligation. Her sire had been a signatory, which meant his progeny inherit his commitments, Mikhail said softly through their bond, his mental voice heavy with unwelcome knowledge. Elena, the blood bond doesn't just connect us. It marks you as active in supernatural politics again. They can call in those old debts. Around the circle, more figures continued to emerge. Elena recognized some from half-remembered court gatherings. A witch whose family had been brewing transformation potions since the Black Death. A vampire lord whose territories included most of the Transylvanian valleys. Creatures whose names she'd forgotten but whose power signatures remained etched in primal memory. The immediate concern, said a new voice, cultured and dangerous, is whether this bond was formed in violation of the Brasov Accords. Elena turned to see a woman who radiated authority like heat from a forge. Tall, sharp-featured, with silver hair swept back to reveal pointed ears and eyes like molten amber, one of the elder Fae, beings whose political machinations could reshape entire regions. Lady Silviana, Councillor Dmitri, inclined his head respectfully. Your presence honors this gathering. Through the blood bond, Elena felt Mikhail's sharp spike of recognition and fear. His memories flooded through their connection. This was the Fey Lord who had engineered his curse, punishment for some transgression he'd committed in 1847. The same year Elena had lost him. The shapeshifter was bound for a reason, Lady Silviana continued, her attention fixed on Mikhail with predatory interest. The terms of his punishment specifically prohibited interference by vampire magic. Yet here we stand, watching ancient justice unravel. Elena stepped protectively in front of Mikhail, her fangs extending in response to the perceived threat. His curse was unjust. A century of punishment for loving the wrong person. Wrong species, Lady Silviana corrected with icy precision. The Accords exist to prevent exactly this kind of cross-supernatural bonding. Such connections upset the balance of power. The gathered creatures murmured agreement, and Elena felt the weight of their collective disapproval like a crushing tide. She'd spent 40 years believing love to be a simple matter of choice and sacrifice. Now she understood it was a political act, with consequences that rippled across supernatural society. There is, said the witch elder, her voice crackling with age and accumulated wisdom, the matter of the bond's unprecedented strength. Such power cannot be ignored or contained. Elena felt Mikhail's hand tighten in hers, his newly human form trembling with exhaustion and growing dread. Through their connection, she sensed his internal struggle, gratitude for his freedom warring with guilt over the complications their reunion had created. What do you propose? Elena asked, though part of her feared the answer. Councillor Dmitri exchanged glances with Lady Silviana before speaking. A formal hearing. The full supernatural council will convene within the fortnight. You will present yourselves to answer for the violation of existing treaties and to determine what accommodations might be made for your unusual situation. And if we refuse? Elena knew the answer before asking, but she needed to hear it spoken. Then you become fugitives from supernatural justice, Lady Silviana replied with something that might have been satisfaction, hunted not merely by mortal vampire hunters, but by every creature bound to uphold the Accords. Your blood bond makes you visible, vampire. You cannot hide as you did before. The truth of it settled over Elena like a funeral shroud. By saving Mikhail, by choosing love over safety, she had indeed crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The life she'd built in exile was truly dead, consumed not just by the hunter's flames but by the impossible politics of the supernatural world. As dawn approached and the gathering began to disperse, Elena understood that their greatest trial lay ahead. The blood bond had given them each other, but it had also made them pawns in a game whose rules she was only beginning to comprehend. The weight of impending judgment settled over Elena like winter earth as the supernatural gathering dispersed into the pre-dawn gloom. 2 weeks, 14 days to prepare for a trial that would determine not just their fate, but the future of every supernatural creature in the Carpathians. Through the blood bond, she felt Mikhail's exhaustion pulling at her consciousness. His newly human form was struggling with the transition from centuries of enforced transformation. "We need shelter," she murmured, guiding him away from the stone circle as the protective energies began to fade with approaching sunrise. "Somewhere to plan, to understand what we're truly facing." But even as they sought refuge in an abandoned shepherd's hut 1/2 mile deeper into the forest, Elena knew there would be no safety. The blood bond pulsed between them like a supernatural beacon, its energy too powerful to hide or suppress. Every heartbeat announced their location to creatures sensitive enough to read such emanations. As Mikhail collapsed onto the rough wooden floor, his skin pale and drawn, Elena felt her greatest fear crystallizing. Not death. She'd made peace with that possibility decades ago. Not even the loss of her carefully constructed exile, though its destruction still ached like an amputated limb. Her deepest terror was far more insidious, that in saving Mikhail, she had doomed him to a fate worse than his curse. "Tell me about Lady Sylviana," she said, kneeling beside him and pressing her palm to his fevered forehead. Through their connection, she felt his memories stirring, fractured images of 1847, of the night everything had gone wrong. "She was jealous," Mikhail whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and remembering. "Not of love, but of power. I was her creature first, Elena. Before the curse, before I met you, I served in her court. A shapeshifter bound to fey magic, enforcing her will across the borderlands. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. You were already claimed when we fell in love, yes." Mikhail's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with desperate intensity. "The blood bond we're creating now isn't just defying the Brazov Accords, it's breaking a binding that's existed for 3 centuries. Sylviana's hold over me was supposed to be absolute, eternal." Through their mystical connection, Elena felt the full scope of what they'd unleashed. The blood bond wasn't simply connecting 2 lovers. It was actively dismantling fey magic that had shaped supernatural politics for generations. Other creatures bound to Lady Sylviana would feel their own chains weakening. Ancient power structures built on forced loyalty and magical compulsion were beginning to crumble. "We're not just fugitives," Elena realized, horror and wonder warring in her chest. "We're revolutionaries." The sound of approaching footsteps outside the hut made them both freeze. Too heavy for human feet, too deliberate for wild animals. Through the blood bond, Elena felt Mikhail's shapeshifter senses extending, cataloging scents and sounds she couldn't perceive. 3 vampires, he breathed, moving with military precision. House Dragomir colors. Elena's blood turned to ice. House Dragomir, one of the most conservative vampire courts, fanatically devoted to maintaining supernatural law. If they'd sent hunters so soon after the Stone Circle gathering, it meant the political situation was even more volatile than she'd understood. "Elena Vassiliev." The voice came from directly outside the door, cultured and implacable. "You will surrender yourself for preliminary questioning. The blood bond you've created constitutes a clear and present danger to supernatural order." She felt Mikhail beginning to shift, his human form rippling with barely contained transformation energy. The curse was broken, but his shapeshifter nature remained, and with it all the protective instincts that had kept him alive through a century of imprisonment. "No." Elena placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath her palm. Through their connection, she projected calm, control, the weight of her decision. "We face this together, but not as animals, not as the monsters they expect us to be." Rising slowly, Elena opened the door to face 3 vampires whose existence she recognized from court gatherings decades past. Ancient creatures whose power radiated like heat from a forge, whose loyalty to supernatural law exceeded even their survival instincts. Behind them stood something that made her breath catch, a mortal, but one whose presence didn't register as entirely human. "Dr. Marius Blackwood," the lead vampire said with grim satisfaction. "Specialist in supernatural pathology. He's here to study your bond before the council convenes." The mortal stepped forward, his pale eyes fixed on Elena with scientific fascination that made her skin crawl. "The energy signatures are remarkable," he murmured, producing instruments she didn't recognize. "Such power should have consumed you both already. The fact that you're still coherent suggests either unprecedented compatibility or what?" Elena demanded. Dr. Blackwood's smile was colder than any vampire's. "Or the bond is still forming, still growing stronger. If my calculations are correct, you have perhaps 3 days before the mystical resonance reaches critical mass." Through their connection, Elena felt Mikhail's sharp spike of terror. He understood something she didn't, some consequence of magical overload that his centuries of supernatural observation had taught him. The trial she'd feared was no longer their greatest threat. The love that had saved them both was becoming the weapon that would destroy everything they touched. The dark moment. "Critical mass means death," Mikhail said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed catastrophe. "Not just for us, for everything within miles." Dr. Blackwood's smile widened as he adjusted a strange crystalline device that hummed with unnatural energy. Not death, precisely. Transformation. The mystical resonance will seek equilibrium by converting all nearby life force into pure magical energy. Trees, animals, humans. Everything becomes fuel for the bond's hunger. Elena felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Through their connection, Mikhail's memories flooded her consciousness. Fragments of stories heard during his cursed decades, whispered accounts of blood bonds that had grown beyond control. A village in the Urals where nothing lived anymore, the very soil turned to glass by uncontrolled vampire magic. A lake in Scotland that still glowed with ethereal light 2 centuries after a shapeshifter pair had loved too deeply, too powerfully. "There has to be a way to stop it," Elena said, but even as the words left her lips, she felt Dr. Blackwood's instruments registering the bond's growing strength. The mystical connection that had seemed like salvation was becoming a countdown to apocalypse. "Oh, there is." The lead vampire, Councillor Theron, Elena now remembered from old court gatherings, stepped closer. Complete severance of the bond, immediate, brutal, permanent. The clinical detachment in his voice made Elena's fangs extend involuntarily. Through the blood bond, she felt Mikhail's desperate understanding of what such severance would mean. Not simply the loss of their connection, but the destruction of everything they'd become together. The parts of themselves that had been restored through love would be torn away, leaving them both less than they'd been before. Elena returned to her isolated exile, Mikhail condemned to exist as neither fully human nor fully wolf. The procedure, Dr. Blackwood added with scientific enthusiasm, requires anchoring each subject's consciousness to their pre-bond state. For Miss Vassiliev, that would mean reinforcing the guilt and isolation that defined her existence for 40 years. For Mikhail, he paused, consulting his instruments. Well, the curse may be broken, but the psychological patterns it created remain. He would retain human form, but lose most human emotional capacity. Elena felt Mikhail's hand tighten in hers, his newly mortal heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Through their connection, she experienced his terror, not of death, but of returning to the grey half-existence that had defined his century of imprisonment. To be human in body, but empty of everything that made existence meaningful. "You're talking about lobotomy," she whispered. "Mystical mutilation." "We're talking about preventing the mystical equivalent of a volcanic eruption," Councillor Theron corrected. "Your personal feelings are irrelevant compared to the lives that will be lost if this bond reaches full manifestation. The worst part," was that Elena could feel the truth of their words through the bond itself. The energy building between them was indeed growing, seeking some ultimate expression that her vampire nature couldn't fully comprehend. What had begun as love was evolving into something vast and hungry, a force that recognized no boundaries between self and other, between creation and destruction. Dr. Blackwood raised his primary instrument, a device that looked like a crystalline tuning fork crossed with a surgeon's blade. The severance must be performed within the next 30 to 6 hours. After that, the bond will have integrated too deeply for safe removal. And if we refuse? Mikhail asked, though Elena felt through their connection that he already knew. Then we contain the threat by other means, Councillor Theron replied with grim finality. House Dragomir has been authorized to use whatever force necessary to prevent a mystical catastrophe. The implications crystallized in Elena's mind with horrible clarity. They would be hunted not as lovers, but as weapons of mass destruction. Every supernatural creature in the region would be mobilized to stop them, not out of malice but out of desperate self-preservation. The blood bond had made them into something the supernatural world could not permit to exist. As if summoned by her despair, Elena felt the bond pulse with sudden, terrifying strength. The wooden walls of the hut groaned, and she saw frost beginning to form on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. Dr. Blackwood's instruments shrieked in harmonic discord, their readings spiking beyond measurable ranges. Emotional stress accelerates the process, he observed with clinical detachment, even as he stepped back from the mystical overflow. Fear, desperation, love, all of it feeds the resonance. Elena looked into Mikhail's eyes and saw her own anguish reflected there. They had found each other across a century of separation, had broken ancient curses and defied the supernatural order itself, only to discover that their love was becoming a poison that would consume everything they'd sought to protect. For the first time since freeing Mikhail from the iron trap, Elena felt the cold certainty of defeat settling into her bones. They could choose mutilation or become unwilling instruments of mass destruction. Either path led to the death of everything they'd fought to preserve. The love that had redeemed them both was about to destroy the world.